On a bitter winter's day in February 1511, Europe's most powerful monarch, King Henry VIII, cradled his sickly son in his arms. After nearly 2 months of precarious hope, it all went apart in an instant. What Henry could never have envisioned was how this solitary loss would trigger a domino effect, one that would rip apart English society, kill thousands, and ultimately come to define the reign of one of history's most brutal monarchs. This was not the loss of an infant, but it was the death of a prince whose life might have changed the course of an entire kingdom. His name was Prince Henry Tudor, Duke of Cornwall. He lived only 52 days, but his brief life and premature death would cast a long shadow over England for centuries. We witness the sorrowful story of a boy who never got to rule, but whose death altered the course of history. His assassination was the first domino to topple in a chain of happenings that would usher in England's bloody break from the Catholic Church, the devastation of its sacred monasteries, the execution of 2 queens, and the founding of a dynasty built on blood and terror. As we journey into this forgotten tragedy, you can see how the death of an innocent ignited centuries of violence, religious conflict, and political turmoil. What you are going to uncover will completely change the way you perceive one of England's bloodiest eras. Let us go back to winter 1510. England was riding high. A young, healthy, and newly anointed Henry VIII had only recently ascended to the throne for 2 years. At 19, he was just the opposite of his cheap and frugal father, Henry VII, spendthrift, charming, and determined to restore England to preeminence in Europe. The king's court sparkled with jousts, feasts, and a burst of the arts. Henry's union with Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of mighty Spanish rulers, had secured a vital alliance with Spain. To the world beyond, it appeared that a golden age was unfolding. But beneath the shining surface lay a nation still haunted by dynastic violence. The Wars of the Roses had lasted only a mere 2 decades ago, and the Tudor claim to power was still precarious, basing more on victory than on a long royal lineage. Henry VII had spent his whole reign repressing uprisings and crushing would-be pretenders to the throne. Now, his son was sure of one thing: only a male heir could cement the Tudor hold on power. Having that heir wasn't just a family requirement, it was a national imperative. In an era where infant mortality claimed 1/3 of children under the age of 1, and where the death of a king without an heir meant civil war, a prince's healthy birth was order versus chaos. Memories of the Yorkist impostors, Lambert Simnel and Perkin Warbeck, who had shaken Henry VII's rule with false claims to the throne, were still fresh in the minds of the nobility. Everyone knew England could not afford another succession crisis. Catherine of Aragon, the older by 6 years to Henry and already a widow of his elder brother, Prince Arthur, carried England's hopes as well as Spain's ambitious aspirations. Her initial pregnancy had miscarried hopelessly in 1510 with the stillbirth of a daughter, heartbreak for both royal houses. Henry's sorrow and Catherine's constant sorrow were vividly portrayed by the Spanish ambassador, an omen of the emotional and political tension this couple would experience in seeking a son. Meanwhile, Europe was seething in unrest. France, in the cunning and warlike Louis XII, menaced perpetually. The Holy Roman Empire, at the behest of Maximilian, played a delicate game of shifting allegiances. Scotland loomed as a menacing threat to the north, and across the continent, emerging religious movements were beginning to germinate. Challenge to the power of the Catholic Church that would come to shake its foundations. In such a dangerous world, a childless king was dangerous to the country. England's fate rode on the back of an heir. But medical knowledge at the time was primitive at best. Doctors in court employed out-of-date theory from ancient Greece, treating ailments with bloodletting or mad herbal solutions. Some believed that a woman's womb could wander around her body. Others blamed failed conceptions on the alignment of the stars. In late 1510, when Catherine announced she was pregnant once more, the kingdom held its breath. It was more than a royal birth. It was a test of the right of the Tudors to occupy the throne. It had never been higher. When the brutal winter gave way to the new year, all eyes were on Richmond Palace. On the first light of the new year, January 1st, 1511, Catherine bore a child. All the details of this event had been meticulously planned. The palace was transformed into a sanctum. Tapestries draped windows for secrecy. Braziers emitted incense to purify the air. Religious symbols adorned the walls to invoke protection. The birthing room resembled more of a holy sanctuary than a medical ward, its walls draped in gold cloth, its quiet broken only by the gentle prayers spoken and the flickering of hundreds of candles lighting crucifixes and illuminated manuscripts. Lady Margaret Pole, Countess of Salisbury, led the Queen's ladies with slow deliberation, adhering to ancient customs with meticulous caution. Outside, Henry VIII paced anxiously, torn between hope and terror. Then, at around 10 a.m., a yell broke the tense silence. The infant prince was born. The wail of his first breath had sparked a blast of joy. Salutes rang out in the palace. Courtiers, who had remained for hours in silent expectation, now burst into ecstasy. Banquets were spread. Bells rang out across the kingdom. England had its wished-for heir, or at least so they believed. But under the joy was a fragile truth, and within weeks ahead, this momentary moment of hope would transmute into despair. The royal doctors, headed by Dr. Fernando Victoria, Queen Catherine's loyal Spanish physician, were quick to announce the birth an unqualified success. Midwives conducted thorough examinations, and everything indicated a robust and healthy male heir. The baby prince was said to be large, blond, and topped with reddish golden hair, unmistakably stamped as the son of Henry VIII. Witnesses were astounded by the vitality of the baby. He cried freely and buckled his limbs with incredible vigor, unmistakable indicators, everyone was certain, of a healthy future monarch. The physicians were all universally delighted with his appearance, breathing, and overall health. The elation was intoxicating for Henry VIII. The fretful father became a man overcome with emotion. Historians penned accounts of the king weeping openly, holding on to the messenger of the news, and dashing to pen letters to courts in Europe in urgency. His hands allegedly trembled as he held the formal proclamation of birth, and his voice trembled with emotion as he announced the birth of his long-awaited son. Days later, Richmond Palace erupted in celebration. Foreign ambassadors, nobles, and courtiers poured in, bearing lavish gifts, silver, gold, fine cloth, and jewels from the distant corners of Europe. Trumpets echoed through palace passageways. Banquets were spread. The birth of Prince Henry Tudor set off a wave of celebratory events the king had not witnessed since his own coronation. Busy couriers on all the royal steeds, fastest horses, were sent to every corner of England, declaring the birth of the prince. All the way from Cornwall to the Scottish border, the kingdom celebrated. Despite still recovering from the bodily exhaustion of giving birth, Queen Catherine received a steady stream of callers to her apartments. Established noblewomen called to pay their respects and catch a glimpse of the miracle baby who now held England's hopes for the future. Spanish courtiers whispered thanks, grateful and proud that their beloved princess had performed her most holy obligation to her adopted homeland. Across England, the celebrations were the stuff of myth. Church bells rang out in London for 3 days and nights, their joyful peals sounding far outside the city. Bonfires raged atop hills all over England, a line of light proclaiming English triumph to the world watching. Instructions for hourly Thanksgiving masses were issued by Archbishop William Warham at Westminster Abbey. Nobles, merchants, and commoners alike thronged to the great cathedral, their voices mingling in thanksgiving and praise. The altar was a blinding sight, filled with the gentle glow of dozens of candles and adorned with gold and silver vases, worth more than the yearly income of some noble mansions. The choir sang hymns written especially for the occasion, their voices echoing to the vaulted ceilings far above, highlighting the grandeur of the moment. Henry VIII ordered generous alms to be distributed across London. Royal arm coins flowed from palace windows down into the streets. Heraldings in every marketplace square shouted the news to cheering crowds. Taverns were commissioned by the crown to provide free ale to all who would take a toast to the health of the prince. The festivities overflowed from palace halls into common dwellings, and the kingdom was united in joy. The foreign ambassadors watched with interest. They knew their presence would be symbolic. They would symbolize loyalty, respect, and diplomacy with England to come. The Venetians presented a jeweled golden cradle. The French presents consisted of valuable silks and tapestries. Spain, elated at the Queen's triumph, presented holy relics said to protect against infancy dangers and a chest full of specially minted coins made of gold. But the highlight of the celebration was yet to come. Henry VIII announced a tremendous tournament, a pageant that would become known in European history as one of the greatest. The king himself is credited with suggestions for much of the festivities, not caring to spend a penny less than necessary. Giant wooden pavilions were built, draped with cloth of gold and adorned by master craftsmen working day and night. Extravagant suits of armor and shining weaponry were hammered out as prizes for tournament victors. Royal proclamations assured banquets large enough to serve 1,000. Palace kitchens worked day and night, cooking exotic foods from Europe and Asia. Peacocks were baked whole and presented with iridescent feathers intact. Whimsical sugarwork told the tale of Tudor triumph. Wines from the finest French and Spanish vineyards flowed freely, kept in store for just such a triumph. These grand festivities were not just personal joy, they were a witness to the world. They showed that the Tudor family wasn't just riding out the storm, but flourishing. England wasn't a small fry, but a superpower with wealth, influence, and a king who ruled with confidence and style. As other European monarchies endured war and despair, England appeared to be invincible under the brilliant rule of Henry. The baptism of Prince Henry Tudor, however, was where politics and showmanship combined best. More than a religious ceremony, the baptism was a scripted political spectacle, intended to reaffirm England's foreign allegiances and exercise Tudor supremacy. Henry's choice of godparents was deliberate. Louis XII of France and Margaret of Austria were named as symbolic sponsors of the prince, grounding the young heir's fate upon two of Europe's great powers. These religious commitments had grave political implications, promising future cooperation and mutual respect. The ritual was conducted within the Observant Friars' Church in Richmond. The sacred compound was beset with a palace of gold and religious symbolism that shone. Cloth of gold-covered walls, such priceless tapestries, as well as relics worth more than entire counties. For the purpose, there was commissioned a solid silver baptismal font adorned with Tudor heraldry and religious symbols, emphasizing the divine right of kings. Holy water consecrated by the Archbishop Warham and saints' relics of England finalized the spiritual preparations. Foreign dignitaries arrived in grand procession. Riding at the head of France, the Duke of Longueville was preceded by a group of nobles dressed in rich finery. Their gifts were equally rich, no richer than one shining golden goblet adorned with gems. It was an approval, and even more, a symbol of acknowledgement. France, as all of Europe, now acknowledged the legitimacy and right of rule of the Tudor dynasty. But even while the world watched and England celebrated, a quiet of foreboding clung in the background, on that would prove to be devastating in the months ahead. The godmother role of Margaret of Austria was heavy diplomatically. Not only was she regent of the Netherlands, but also a paramount member of the powerful Habsburgs, whose dominion stretched across both the Holy Roman Empire and Spain. Even though she couldn't be present in person at the baptism, she was represented by her designated proxy, the Countess of Surrey, an unmistakable indication that the Habsburgs were keeping close eyes on England and eager to pursue close connections with Henry VIII, no matter the volatile and frequently belligerent shifting of the alliances of European politics. The baptism itself followed ancient ceremonial tradition that highlighted the divine nature of royal powers. The infant prince wore white silk clothes embroidered with golden thread, an outward manifestation of purity, potency, and divine favor. The blessed chrism with which he was anointed had been prepared in particular with oils blessed by the Pope himself, further religious sanctity given to Tudor privilege. According to modern descriptions, the prince remained remarkably composed throughout the elaborate ceremony. His composure was read as a sign of aristocratic temperament, and his lusty, robust cry during the ceremony was greeted as evidence of bodily health, a healthy start for a king to make. Amongst the nobles who were present, the seriousness of the time was not to be doubted. Everyone understood that they stood judged by the king and made sure to conduct themselves accordingly in terms of their behavior, gifts, and gestures. Therefore, expressions of gratitude became officious and calculating. Exquisite gifts were given not only to honor the prince, but to secure grace in the future in a court where fortunes might seal the destiny of a noble. The ceremony concluded with a dazzling feast that lasted into the evening, with music, poetry, and lavish pageantry. England's finest artists and performers amused as the baby prince was paraded out and displayed, a living reminder of Tudor authority, security, and the promise of stability. Immediately after the baptism, the prince was granted his own royal household, an extraordinary move that reflected Henry VIII's deep confidence in his son's future. This miniature court mirrored the complexity of European palaces, staffed by dozens of servants and supported by immense financial resources. It was not just about comfort, it was a powerful visual assertion of wealth, legitimacy, and dynastic pride. Prince Henry Tudor's short life was spent in this world of luxury and domination. Richmond Palace was altered to accommodate the baby heir's needs. His bedrooms were maintained at carefully regulated temperatures, fires constantly being attended by a team of dedicated servants. Wall tapestries displayed images of England's glorious past, an attempt made to make him great from the beginning. The prince's day was governed by rigorous, time-proven rituals. Every feeding, every nap time, every diaper change was recorded. They weren't just attendants. These were guardians of England's future. The royal nursery boasted more than 30 staff members, wet nurses chosen for both flawless health and exemplary morals, rockers whose only purpose was to gently rock the cradle, and night guards who stood sentry over the prince throughout each dark time. Dr. Fernando Victoria oversaw the prince's treatment under a combination of contemporary medical science and folk remedies. He designed customized diets for the wet nurses to better quality the milk, and performed regular measurements of the baby's growth. Contemporary accounts of these tests show a thriving child, gaining weight consistently, responding strongly to touch and noise, and displaying every sign of good health. Even the prince's clothing bore witness to his royal destiny. His closet held garments fashioned of silk, velvet, and golden fabric, dwarf masterpieces that were stitched with pearls and thread. Each garment had to be blessed by a royal chaplain before it was placed upon him. His swaddling clothes were changed multiple times a day, in accordance with customs dating back many centuries that were believed to keep him healthy and prevent disease. Henry VIII himself was a frequent visitor to the nursery. He visited his son daily, often staying for hours, watching him sleep or feed, and cradling him in his arms with a tenderness that surprised courtiers. Henry, known as a hard-nosed military leader and ruthless politician, was revealing a softer image as a father, his pride in the infant obvious. Visitors commented on how his face would brighten when he spoke of his son and how carefully he would rock the boy in his arms. Security for the prince was unprecedented, even by royal standards. Every entrance to his apartments was guarded, and all food, especially that consumed by his wet nurses, was rigorously inspected. Food tasters were employed to prevent any possible poisoning. The extreme precautions reflected not just Henry VIII's paternal devotion, but also his awareness of the dynasty's vulnerability. The prince's life wasn't just precious to the royal family, it was the bedrock of England's political stability. Strict protocol controlled access to the nursery. The most senior nobles were required to undergo rituals of purification before they could approach the child. Daily reports on every detail of the prince's life, from his sleep patterns to his reflexes, were prepared and submitted to the king, a crude form of clinical record-keeping that was a manifestation both of paternal concern and of the political importance of having the heir's health under surveillance. Then, in the 6th week of Prince Henry's life, something changed. At first, the signs were subtle. Physicians described inconsistencies in his feeding pattern, periods of intense nursing followed by sudden moments of weakness and lack of interest. These fluctuations were not in themselves cause for alarm, but they were the first departure from what had been a textbook case of healthy royal infancy. Dr. Victoria, sensing the potential threat, ordered more frequent checkups and consulted with his medical colleagues to determine possible causes. The mood within the royal household began to change. from joy to cautious worry. Something was wrong. At first, the changes in young Prince Henry's condition were subtle, barely noticeable to anyone but those outside the nursery. To people who, however, had grown used to his robust cries and vigorous movements, these did not go unnoticed. Quietly, murmurs regarding the prince's increasing stillness began to circulate among court watchers. Royal physicians, hoping it was merely a phase, kept these concerns concealed from the king and queen. The wet nurses started to notice issues with his feedings. Some days the prince ate eagerly, and others he was not interested, even lethargic. His sleep extended longer, and his waking periods were less active. His color would sometimes pale, but then clear just as quickly. Diagnosis still elusive. Dr. Fernando Victoria responded with more observation, watching his breathing, temperature, and responsiveness. He studied ancient medical texts in secret and conferred with trusted colleagues, trying to interpret the prince's dire symptoms. King Henry VIII, visiting as often as he did, began to sense that something was amiss. Slight as the signs were, his fatherly instincts were aroused. His questions about the prince's health became more probing, his demeanor more insistent. Queen Catherine of Aragon, still convalescing from childbed, would not remain inactive. Stretching out her visits to the nursery, she watched her son with a piercing eye. Her maternal instincts told her what physicians would not dare to whisper. Something was wrong. Her Spanish attendants noticed the queen's growing distress, even as she showed a composed face to the world. Privately, however, she demanded that the doctors inform her of everything, desperate to protect her son. Meanwhile at court, a whispered concern began to circulate discreetly. Nobles who had celebrated the prince's birth with lavish ceremony in the past now watched the royal family with close attention, knowing that an illness in a child could all too easily turn into a national crisis. By early February, the symptoms of the prince were too disturbing to ignore. Dr. Victoria finally visited the king with a frank but diplomatic warning. He explained that while many infants survived early health crises, there was reason to worry. It was a delicate balance, honesty about the danger tempered with hope. But hope soon gave way to horror. The end came sooner than anyone had expected. On the early morning of February 22, 1511, Prince Henry's health worsened. Night watchers noticed that his breathing was shallow, labored, and irregular. His complexion took on a pale grayish color, an ominous sign to any physician of that era. They summoned Dr. Victoria and the other court doctors at once in alarm. Despite their desperate efforts, bloodletting, herbal draughts, whispered prayers, nothing could stem the prince's decline. His robust cries diminished to weak whimpers. His little body, so full of promise, now fought a losing battle with an illness no one could name and no remedy could cure. By the time Henry VIII arrived at the nursery, his son was at the end of his life. The scene was one that would haunt the English court, the mighty king crying and overcome, cradling his frail heir. Those present talked of the heartbreaking scene as tears streamed down the monarch's face, falling upon his dying son's body. There was nothing Henry could do, for all his power. It was around 11 a.m. that the prince took his last breath. Royal scribes recorded the exact time, and Dr. Victoria, after attempting every remedy available, pronounced him dead. Prince Henry Tudor, Duke of Cornwall, was no more, just 7 weeks after his victorious birth. The country's hopes perished in silence. Queen Catherine was beside herself with grief straightway. She fainted, and her attendants were in fear for her own life as the grief took hold of her. Spanish ladies-in-waiting recalled that the queen seemed to age years overnight. Her wails of despair echoed through Richmond Palace, and the sounds of merriment were exchanged for a gloom that settled over the whole court. Physicians conducted an autopsy, but no definitive cause of death was established. As was the custom in the 16th century, the diagnosis yielded to natural causes, a catch-all phrase that masked the limitations of contemporary medicine. The truth was simple but ghastly. They had no clue why he died, and that not knowing would haunt Henry and Catherine for years to come. The palace was transformed overnight from a source of joy into a house of mourning. Planned festivities were canceled. Banners were replaced by black drapes. The court went into solemn ritual for a time as messengers took the sorrowful news to royal households across Europe. Just weeks after those households had been celebrating the prince's birth, and even in mourning, a king has to play his part. Henry VIII presented himself in public with a calculated image. His role demanded strength, dignity, and infallible leadership. But behind the mask of regal decorum was a father broken-hearted. Those close to him saw the truth in private moments, the pain that no crown could hide. Amazingly, within a week of his baby son's death, King Henry VIII was again in the public domain, appearing relaxed and fully engaged in royal affairs. Outwardly, he remained the same self-assured, unflappable king. Yet behind palace walls, he was a man devastated by grief. His closest and dearest knew the tight jaw, the short temper, the restless energy that masked profound emotional pain. Control, rather than mourning, was his first priority. Henry knew the stakes. England's enemies were watching and waiting. Any display of weakness could be read as vulnerability, a summons to competitors to take advantage of the sudden uncertainty of the Tudor succession. To head off panic, royal proclamations rushed to reassure the public. Though the death of Prince Henry was lamented bitterly, the king, young and healthy, was expected to have more heirs. It was a message of resilience, intended to keep the kingdom grounded in a moment of profound instability. But beneath the show of strength, Henry was falling apart. Contemporary observers noted a palpable shift in the king's demeanor. Henry, who had been convivial and court-loving, grew increasingly withdrawn. He berated courtiers over trifles. He plunged into military exercises and hunting parties, pushing his body to exhaustion in a desperate quest to quiet the grief. Lavish court entertainments that had filled his days with laughter and music gave place to silence and gloom. The vibrant young king was beginning to darken, a shadow of what he had been mere months earlier. When the time came to bury Prince Henry, the king focused his sorrow on a single, overwhelming action, a funeral like no other. It was one of the most extravagant and expensive royal ceremonies in English history. The preparations lasted for weeks, occupying hundreds of craftsmen, tailors, and artists. Westminster Abbey was turned into a cathedral of bereavement. Its walls hung with the finest black material, its thousands of candles sparkling like stars on a somber sky. The high altar shone in cloth of gold and priceless relics. At the center was the tiny coffin, constructed of the finest English oak, lined with velvet and precious metals. Above it, a specially commissioned canopy symbolized the child's royal status, heir, though he never ruled. The funeral procession was miles long, beginning at Richmond Palace and winding through the streets of London. Thousands lined the route, nobles in their robes, bishops singing hymns, guild members carrying banners, an entire nation mourning a prince it had scarcely had time to know. Archbishop William Warham officiated at the final rites, accompanied by a full choir and specially composed music. The ceremony ended on a solemn note, the breaking of the staff of office of the prince, together with prayers for the health of the king and queen and for future heirs. The child was dead, but the political repercussions were only just beginning. News of the prince's death quickly spread across Europe, and royal courts were left stunned. French strategists, who had been making plans on the assumption of a stable English dynasty, now urgently set to work recasting their plans. In Spain, Queen Catherine's homeland, officials were worried that her influence at court had suddenly been reduced. After all, her value in England had been largely due to her ability to produce a male heir. At the English court, the mood shifted radically. The future, so sure before, was once again uncertain. Nobles who had banked on their association with baby Prince Henry suddenly found themselves in a treacherous limbo. Alliances shifted quietly, ambitions were rebrokered, and a confident king was consumed by one overwhelming fixation: to produce a living male heir. That need would define the rest of his reign. The anguish of his son's death left deep wounds. Henry became increasingly impatient, increasingly paranoid. He began to interpret the disaster as not merely a personal grief, but also as possibly a sign of divine displeasure. His obsession with guaranteeing the Tudor dynasty would become more fierce, compelling him to make decisions that would alter English religion, law, and family life forever. Queen Catherine of Aragon, once secure in her position, now found herself on unstable ground. Though she remained the king's wife and queen, her position silently deteriorated. She continued to become pregnant, but none of the children survived. Each pregnancy was met with guarded optimism, and each failure intensified the sense of doom that surrounded the royal family. The disappointments in succession formed a painful cycle: celebration, anxiety, loss, and silence. The ordeal of childbearing was a hallmark of court existence. Every pregnancy was accompanied by lavish ritual and religious precaution: pilgrimages, fasting, masses, and expensive donations intended to gain God's favor. Yet all the prayers and gold in the kingdom could not alter the result. No sons survived. In due course, Henry's grief yielded to frustration, then anger. As was the practice of the day, fertility issues were the fault of women. Catherine was to blame. Henry's attitude changed, from loving husband to critical disapprover. His sympathy evaporated. His eyes began to wander. Frantic for an heir, the king grew increasingly dependent on religion, not for comfort, but as a tool for bargaining. He commanded constant prayer and services, emptied the royal treasury on pilgrimages, and tried to strike deals with God. But heaven was silent. The cradle remained empty. The repercussions extended far beyond one grieving couple. Without a clear heir, Henry began to consider solutions that would once have been unthinkable: female succession, or even leaving the throne to distant male cousins. The whole basis of English succession law was thrown into doubt. Lawyers dug up ancient precedents, explored every possibility, and drew up contingency plans for a future that no one wanted to face. And Catherine went on trying, pregnancy after pregnancy, loss after loss. With each, she weakened. With each, the king's patience grew thinner. By the time the world realized how deeply this early tragedy had affected Henry's mind, the kingdom had already begun to change in ways no one could have imagined. One man's personal grief would spark a royal crisis, one that would ultimately lead to divorce, religious revolution, and the establishment of a Second English Reformation. It began with the quiet death of a baby prince. The death of Prince Henry Tudor on that icy February morning in 1511 is one of history's most riveting reminders of the power of a single, fleeting moment to alter the course of civilization. In the space of 7 weeks and 2 days, England's fate veered dramatically off course, from that of a secure Catholic monarchy with a stable male heir to that of religious upheaval, political rebellion, and sweeping cultural change. Had the young prince lived and eventually worn the crown as King Henry IX, the entire trajectory of English and European history could have been irrevocably different. His survival would have preserved Queen Catherine of Aragon's position, preventing Henry VIII's desperate pivot toward Anne Boleyn, and with it, England's historic split from the Catholic Church. The consequences would have been seismic. England might have remained firmly beneath the Catholic umbrella, and the tectonic plates of the English Reformation would never have shifted. Monasteries would not have been dissolved, their lands would not have been redistributed among the nobility, and England's religious and political history might well have followed a path much more similar to that of continental Europe. In this alternate world, Anne Boleyn would have remained a minor character at court, and Elizabeth I, very probably England's finest monarch, would never have been born. There would have been no golden age of Shakespeare, no great voyages of discovery, and perhaps no defeat of the Spanish Armada. England's naval supremacy, its colonial venture, and its impact on the contemporary world would all have been differently realized. And herein lies the greatest irony. Henry VIII already had the son he so desperately longed for, but when he lost that son, it devastated him. In his grief, he set himself on a path that would ultimately ruin his marriage, divide the church, and claim the lives of hundreds of his subjects, noble and commoner. His obsession with obtaining another male heir drove him to do things he would never have done before that terrible day. This psychological wound, inflicted by the death of a healthy child despite every benefit wealth and power could offer, festered for years. It warped the king's character, infecting his relationships and corroding the very institutions he had once sworn to uphold. Catherine's situation was precarious, though the full consequences would not mature for years. Each subsequent pregnancy was a cycle of hope and failure, which fostered Henry's growing paranoia and superstition. The ripple effect extended far beyond the Tudor family. The Protestant Reformation in England, the birth of Anglicanism, the rise of parliamentary authority, and eventually the establishment of the British Empire, all trace their beginnings to the grief of a father who held his dying son and was never the same again. And perhaps most chilling of all, the tyranny and violence of Henry VIII's later reign. The executions of Sir Thomas More and Bishop John Fisher, the beheadings of Anne Boleyn and Catherine Howard, the burning of both Protestant and Catholic martyrs, can all be linked back to the emotional devastation of that single tragic loss. The king who cradled his dying son in 1511 was not yet the tyrannical autocrat who would harass his court and kingdom. But in those hours of powerless sorrow, the seeds were sown. The vacant cradle at Richmond Palace came to be more than a reminder of bereavement. It was one of the most fateful vacancies in history. Sometimes the people who leave the deepest impression on the world are not those who ruled, warred, or led armies, but those whose brief lives were cut off before they could leave their mark. Prince Henry never reigned. He never issued a law or led a campaign. And yet, his death created a chain of events that changed the English-speaking world. As we reflect on this overlooked tragedy, we're left with a sobering fact. The constitutional freedoms, religious reforms, and cultural achievements of the modern West were born to some extent from the womb of a dead child, a victim who died too soon, but whose absence echoes for centuries.